30,000 soldiers marched through a mountain pass in November 1330, convinced the war was already won. Above them, hidden among the rocks and trees, an entire army had been waiting in silence for days. Boulders sat balanced at cliff edges. Tree trunks hung suspended by ropes. Archers crouched motionless in the shadows. The signal came when the last Hungarian soldier entered the valley. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was annihilation. Rocks cascaded from the heights. Horses collapsed screaming. Supply carts exploded into kindling. The Hungarian army, one of medieval Europe's most formidable forces, found every escape route sealed, every counterattack repelled. Within 4 days, 30,000 men were reduced to scattered survivors crawling through the darkness. This is the story of Posada, where confidence became catastrophe, where an entire kingdom learned that size means nothing when the mountains decide who lives and who dies. To understand why 30,000 soldiers died in a mountain pass, you need to understand the politics of 14th century Eastern Europe. This was a world where borders weren't fixed lines on maps. They were negotiations. Power didn't come from treaties. It came from whoever could enforce their will season after season. Wallachia sat south of the Carpathian Mountains, wedged between the Kingdom of Hungary to the north and the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south. For generations, Wallachia existed in a carefully managed state of semi-independence. But by the late 1320s, something fundamental had changed. A ruler named Basarab I had consolidated power in ways previous Wallachian leaders never managed. He united rival factions that had spent generations fighting each other. He secured loyalty from regional nobles who'd previously acted as independent warlords. He controlled the critical trade routes between the Danube River and the Carpathian Passes. Most importantly, Basarab stopped behaving like a subordinate. He didn't openly declare independence. That would have invited immediate war. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. When Hungary sent demands, Basarab treated them as suggestions rather than commands. From Basarab's perspective, Wallachia was becoming a legitimate state with its own sovereignty. And to King Charles I of Hungary, this looked like a challenge that could not be ignored. Charles had spent the previous decade rebuilding Hungarian royal authority after years of internal chaos. Allowing a border ruler to drift away from Hungarian control would send exactly the wrong message. So Charles framed the coming military campaign very carefully. This wasn't presented to his nobles as a war of conquest. It was described as enforcement. The preparation reflected Hungary's confidence. Charles assembled a force of approximately 30,000 men, massive by regional standards. This wasn't a raiding party or a punitive expedition. This was a full royal host designed to overwhelm through sheer presence. The army included royal troops loyal directly to the crown. Noble contingents brought their own retainers and banners. Heavy cavalry formed the backbone, armored knights on powerful war horses, the medieval equivalent of modern tanks. Behind them came infantry, spearmen, crossbowmen, support troops, engineers who could construct field fortifications if needed, and a long supply train of wagons carrying food, tools, spare equipment, and everything necessary to sustain a campaign. The assumption driving all this preparation was simple. Wallachia would fold once this force appeared. Basarab would see 30,000 professional soldiers, recognize the futility of resistance, and submit. November 1330, the army crossed into Wallachia. At first, everything confirmed Hungarian expectations. No opposing army materialized on the horizon. No defensive fortifications blocked the roads. No resistance appeared. Villages along the route sat completely abandoned. Doors hung open. Cooking fires were cold. Livestock were gone. To Hungarian commanders, this looked exactly like victory. The population was fleeing in terror. Basarab was avoiding confrontation because he knew he couldn't win one. But as days turned into weeks, the pattern became harder to ignore. Every single settlement was empty, not just evacuated, but stripped. No food remained in storehouses. No supplies could be requisitioned. Foraging parties returned with nothing. The baggage train, initially intended as backup, became the army's sole source of provisions. The terrain grew more difficult without warning. Valleys narrowed unexpectedly. They'd simply walked through an empty land that seemed deliberately arranged to slow them down. After 2 weeks, King Charles faced an uncomfortable reality. His army had proven its ability to march into Wallachia, but it hadn't proven anything else. Basarab remained invisible. Winter was approaching. Supplies were running dangerously low. Horses were exhausted from difficult terrain. Continuing forward offered no clear objective. The only rational decision was withdrawal. So Charles gave the order. The Hungarian host would turn north, cross back through the Carpathian passes, and return home. Among the soldiers, the decision brought visible relief. The frustrating campaign was ending. The dangerous part was behind them. They were going home. What 30,000 Hungarian soldiers didn't understand was that turning around was exactly what Basarab had been waiting for. While the Hungarians marched through empty villages, Basarab had been making very different preparations. He'd never intended to meet this army in open battle. That would have been suicide. So Basarab built his entire strategy around a single principle: control the terrain, control the outcome. He studied how medieval armies moved. He understood their logistical requirements, their tactical preferences, their psychological patterns. Instead, he emptied the land ahead of the Hungarian advance. Not in panic, but systematically. Villagers moved livestock into hills and forests. Supplies were relocated to hidden locations. Roads were watched but not blocked. The goal wasn't to stop the Hungarian advance. While Hungarian commanders interpreted the empty villages as fear, Basarab was carefully tracking their movements. He knew where they were. He knew their pace. He knew their likely withdrawal routes. And when Charles finally made the decision to retreat, Basarab knew exactly where the Hungarian army would go. There was one primary pass through the Carpathians that offered the fastest route back to Hungarian territory. The terrain funneled retreating armies toward this corridor naturally. Basarab had already selected his killing ground. A narrow mountain pass where steep slopes rose sharply on both sides. A single compressed road through the center. No space for cavalry maneuvers. No room for defensive formations. No quick escape routes. Perfect ambush terrain. 4 days before the Hungarian army arrived, Wallachian forces moved into position. This wasn't a single concentrated force, it was many small groups, each assigned specific sections of the heights overlooking the road. Archers climbed to concealed ledges where they could fire downward and retreat quickly. They were instructed to target horses first, then officers, then anyone attempting to organize resistance. Work crews hauled stones to cliff edges. Some were massive boulders that would crush anything they hit. Others were smaller rocks that could be rolled continuously. Logs were positioned on steep slopes, already tilted, requiring only a final push to send them tumbling. Trees near cliff edges were cut halfway through, strong enough to stand, weak enough to fall with coordinated effort. Behind the pass, escape routes were subtly altered. Not blocked outright, just narrowed and complicated enough to delay a sudden reversal without revealing the trap's presence. Basarab's orders to his commanders were extremely specific. No one attacks early. No one reveals themselves. No one descends to the road. The entire Hungarian column, vanguard, center, supply train, rear guard, must be fully inside the corridor before the first stone falls. This trap required patience. When preparations were complete, the Wallachian forces disappeared into the landscape. From the road below, nothing appeared unusual, just another mountain pass on the route home. In November 9, 1330, morning light broke over the Carpathian Mountains. Hungarian scouts reached the entrance to the pass and conducted their standard reconnaissance. They rode a short distance into the corridor. They checked for obstacles. They looked for signs of enemy presence. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The scouts reported back. The route was safe. The vanguard began entering the pass. Armored cavalry rode first, maintaining formation as the road narrowed. Their horses' hooves echoed off the stone walls rising on both sides. Behind them came infantry units, marching in column. Then the critical supply wagons, wheels groaning under their loads. The center of the army followed, More cavalry, more infantry, the main body of Charles's force. Finally, the rear guard closed in, protecting the army's tail. The entire column stretched through the mountain corridor like a steel snake, compressed and vulnerable. On the heights above, Basarab I stood motionless. Around him, Wallachian soldiers crouched in complete silence. Bows were strung but not drawn. Hands rested near balanced boulders but didn't push. Basarab's eyes tracked the Hungarian advance with calculating precision. The vanguard disappeared around a distant bend in the pass, too far forward to help the rear. The center filled the middle section, the densest concentration of troops. Supply wagons bunched together where the road narrowed most, creating natural choke points. The rear guard entered the corridor, closing the final escape route. Basarab watched the spacing. He measured the distances. He waited for absolute commitment. Only when every Hungarian soldier had entered the pass, when retreat would require the same exposure as advance, did Basarab's hand finally move. His arm dropped sharply, and the first boulder struck without warning. A massive stone plummeted from the left slope and obliterated a supply wagon near the vanguard. Horses screamed and reared. Before Hungarian soldiers could process what happened, the entire mountainside responded. Boulders fell from both slopes simultaneously, not randomly, with terrible precision. Rocks smashed into wagon after wagon, shattering wheels, crushing drivers, creating instant roadblocks. Massive stones crushed horses mid-stride. Soldiers disappeared beneath cascading debris. Then the arrows began. Not a single organized volley like a traditional battlefield, continuous waves from multiple elevations and angles. Wallachian archers targeted the draft horses first. When wagon horses collapsed with arrows in their flanks and necks, they created immovable obstacles that sealed sections of the road. Next came the officers. Anyone in decorated armor, anyone shouting commands, anyone trying to restore tactical cohesion. Arrows found them with methodical accuracy. The Hungarian army attempted to respond. Crossbowmen fired upward into the slopes. Their bolts disappeared into trees and rocks, hitting nothing. Knights tried to organize cavalry charges up the slopes, but heavy warhorses couldn't climb steep, rocky terrain in full armor. They slipped on loose stones. They stumbled on uneven ground. Infantry units attempted to climb and engage the archers directly, but climbing requires both hands. Shields had to be lowered, and when shields lowered, arrows found exposed flesh. Those who reached higher ground discovered their enemies had already withdrawn to even higher positions. The Wallachian forces refused to hold static positions. They struck and vanished. They fired and relocated. Meanwhile, the formation on the road below collapsed inward. Forward elements tried to retreat backward. Rear elements kept pushing forward, unaware of the chaos ahead. The middle compressed into a churning mass of panicked men and horses. Space disappeared entirely. Then the logs began rolling. Massive tree trunks released from the slopes above. They didn't fall straight down, they rolled and bounced unpredictably. A spinning log would strike a cluster of soldiers, sending bodies flying. Then it would bounce and strike again, and again. Some logs were large enough to crush armored knights. Others swept legs out from under entire groups. The sound became overwhelming. Rock striking metal, with splintering bone, horses screaming, men shouting for help that couldn't come, officers trying to give orders that couldn't be heard, and all of it echoing endlessly off the narrow valley walls, amplifying the chaos. By midday, Hungarian commanders understood their reality. This wasn't an attack from a direction they could face. The terrain itself was killing them. Night brought no relief. The bombardment stopped, but movement remained impossible. Dead horses blocked the road in multiple locations. Shattered wagons created impassable barriers. Wounded soldiers lay scattered, unable to be moved safely. Lighting fires would create targets for archers. But without fires, the November cold pressed down mercilessly. No one slept. Everyone waited in tense darkness for dawn. Morning arrived. The killing resumed. Day 2 brought desperate attempts at organization. Hungarian commanders planned coordinated assaults on the heights. Infantry would climb under covering fire from crossbowmen below. The attacks were brave and completely futile. Soldiers struggled up steep slopes while carrying weapons and wearing armor. Those who reached elevated positions found them already abandoned. Wallachian forces had withdrawn higher before the Hungarians arrived. Then arrows would fall from even further up the slope, driving the exhausted climbers back down. All day, the Hungarians tried to clear the road and restore movement. Destroyed wagons were laboriously pushed to the side, under constant arrow fire. Dead horses were cut from their harnesses and dragged away, while stones continued falling intermittently. Bodies were moved just enough to create narrow passages, only to have new casualties fill the space. Thirst became agonizing. Water sources were visible, streams running down the slopes, but completely exposed to archer fire. Men who tried to reach water were shot. Hunger set in as the destroyed supply wagons meant no access to provisions. By the third day, discipline fractured completely. Orders were ignored. Chain of command broke down. Small groups acted on desperate individual initiative. Some soldiers charged uphill in berserker rage, screaming challenges, attacking empty forest. Almost none returned. Others attempted to climb the slopes at night, hoping darkness would provide cover. Some escaped into the hills. Many were found by Wallachian patrols and killed quietly. The attacks from above became selective rather than constant. Stones targeted any gathering of more than a few soldiers. Arrows targeted anyone attempting to organize others or showing leadership. By day 4, the Hungarian army had ceased to exist as a military force. There were no formations, no units, no organized defense, just scattered groups of survivors, some protecting wounded comrades, others simply waiting to die or escape. King Charles I of Hungary was among them. The king who had entered Wallachia with 30,000 soldiers now crouched behind an overturned wagon with a handful of guards. The fighting didn't end with a climactic final battle. It simply faded into exhausted silence. On the 4th day, Basarab ordered his forces to cease attacks. The objective was complete. There was nothing left to destroy. Wallachian soldiers descended to the pass for the first time since the ambush began. The scene was apocalyptic. Thousands of bodies lay scattered among shattered wagons and dead horses. The road was unrecognizable, buried under debris and corpses. Blood had turned sections of the dirt road into mud. Basarab walked through the carnage without visible emotion. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was confirmation of a brutal calculation. Hungary had entered his land believing size equaled victory. The mountains had taught them otherwise. Among the survivors fleeing north through other mountain routes, King Charles moved in silence. He had escaped with his life, but he'd lost everything else. His army was destroyed. His authority was shattered. His reputation was ruined. The man who'd led 30,000 soldiers into Wallachia returned with barely a few hundred. When survivors reached Hungarian territory, they carried more than trauma. They carried a story that would fundamentally reshape regional politics. Wallachia was not a vassal to be corrected with military force. It was a dangerous neighbor that could destroy armies in its own terrain. After 1330, Hungary never again attempted to enforce control over Wallachia through invasion. The relationship changed permanently. For Basarab, Posada accomplished everything. His rule was no longer theoretical or disputed. It was enforced by victory and protected by reputation. Future Hungarian kings would remember what happened in that mountain pass. And remembering meant respecting Wallachian independence. Posada also transformed military thinking across Eastern Europe. Heavy cavalry, the dominant military force of the medieval period, had been revealed as helpless in confined terrain. Large armies showed vulnerability when their size became a liability rather than an advantage. The battle demonstrated that superior numbers meant nothing when movement was controlled and retreat was denied. 7 centuries later, Posada remains in military curricula at academies around the world. Not because the tactics were particularly innovative, ambushes are as old as warfare itself, but because the psychology is timeless. Posada is studied as a case study in overconfidence, in assuming that strength guarantees victory. in forgetting that terrain chooses winners more often than weapons. The pattern has repeated throughout history. Napoleon's Grande Armée, the most powerful military force in Europe, froze and starved in Russian winter. Superior numbers couldn't overcome distance and weather. The German Wehrmacht, technologically superior and tactically brilliant, bled to death in Stalingrad's urban ruins. Modern weapons couldn't overcome defensive terrain. American forces, with overwhelming technological advantage, struggled for years in Vietnamese jungles. Air power and artillery couldn't defeat an enemy who controlled the ground. Soviet armies, equipped with modern armor and aircraft, spent a decade failing to control Afghan mountains. Technology couldn't overcome local knowledge and terrain advantage. The lesson remains the same across 700 years. Power is meaningless when the land decides the outcome. Today, if you drive through the Carpathian Mountains, you can still find the approximate location of the Posada Pass. There are no monuments, no plaques, no tourist markers, just a winding mountain road through steep terrain. But the landscape remembers, in the way the cliffs rise sharply on both sides, in the way the road compresses into a narrow corridor, in the way gravity flows downward with irresistible force. The geography that killed 30,000 men in 1330 hasn't changed. And the lesson carved into that land remains as true today as it was then. Before you march into unfamiliar territory, understand one fundamental truth. Your strength only matters if the ground allows you to use it. The moment you enter terrain that negates your advantages, you're not fighting an enemy. You're fighting the earth itself, and the earth always wins.